while I'm setting things up here, let me tell you a little story that is relevant to several of us here. I assume everybody heard Dr. Nathan's presentation yesterday morning. This happened to me a couple days ago, and it's not the first time it's happened, where I've been at a gathering of a lot of people, with this interest, and a young guy comes up to me and says to me, sort of eagerly says, "Dr. Nathan?" And the takeaway that's particularly relevant to some of us here is that all old white guys look the same. Okay. All right. Are we live here? Or wait, hang on. Okay, the other thing, if you look at your, there we go. Is that, yeah, okay. If you look at your little program guide, you'll see that your reward for being here early on Sunday is Ayani and I have by far the longest titled presentations that you're going to be hearing today. Okay, normally when we talk about sabermetrics, we're talking about explaining and optimizing strategy, performance, and talent evaluation, but there's other uses we can use for these tools, and that's what I'm going to try to do here today, to talk about some payroll considerations based on an analysis of some of the data that are available. So, younger players have played a growing role in the game. There have been a lot of articles written about this. We've seen, particularly on the hitter side, we've seen some very talented players promoted rapidly through the minors to the majors, where they've taken substantial roles, starting roles, not bench roles, and not just with rebuilding teams, but also with teams in the heat of pennant races. That's borne out a lot by the top 3 vote getters in last year's Rookie of the Year voting, who are all players who are quite young, who did exceptionally well, and who played roles with teams that were in pennant contention. And this kind of illustrates both their excellence and their youth. We had only one legally player. Now, my former editor-in-chief at Baseball Prospectus, Sam Miller, did a study on this in December of last year, and what he looked at is these sorts of players 25 or under, who are hitters. And what Sam found is that they had a collective OPS plus of 103, which means, this is a baseball reference statistic, on average, their offensive performance was 3% better than the overall league average. These were better than average performers, kind of belying the idea that everybody peaks at age 27. Partly as a result of this, players 25 or younger hitters accounted for 28% of plate appearances last year. That's the highest proportion since 1978, which shows that they've been outstanding performers. And we can all recall within this decade, we've seen really great hitters at very young ages rise to the top of the MVP voting. Harper, Trout, and Bryant were all quite young when they received their MVPs. However, some have seen kind of nefarious downside to this, and that is that very young players don't get paid as much as older players are. We've seen, as a result of the number of young players on rosters growing, we've also seen payrolls flatten out. These data are from Forbes, and you can see not only did payrolls kind of flatten out the last few years, they actually turned down in 2018, and 2018 was yet another year in which MLB revenues were at all-time highs. So I want to look at that relationship. And I think everyone here knows this, so I'm going to go through it quickly. The role of service time in determining player salary. The first 3 years that a player's in the majors, it's as if the reserve clause never went away. They're paid based on what management decides to pay them. There's a floor determined by the MLB minimum, but that also is a little bit of a ceiling as well. Right in time for this conference, we saw the Rays renew the defending Cy Young Award winner for $18,000 more than the MLB minimum. After the first 3 years of service time, a player is eligible for arbitration once he enters his 4th year through his 6th year. That, at least in theory, should give a player the ability to get paid commensurate to what his peers are, but it's only after players been in the majors for 6 years, starting in his 7th year, that he's able to auction his services off to the highest bidder, which is basically what almost all of us in the room are able to do professionally with our salaries. And a couple footnotes here. There's some players become eligible for arbitration after 2 years. It's not a lot, and I don't think it's particularly germane to what I'm looking at here. So ultimately, while we've seen this influx of youth, it's not really age that's driving player comp and the trends that Forbes graph showed you. It's experience. And I'm going to show you 4 players here. Mike Trout, Joey Wendell. Trout received MVP votes. Wendell received Rookie of the Year votes last year. Yasiel Puig and Max Muncy, of course, were teammates on the Dodgers. Trout's about a year and a half or so younger than Wendell. Puig is a few months younger than Muncy, but Trout made 62 times as much as Joey Wendell. Puig made 17 times as much as Max Muncy. The reason is that last year Trout was free agency eligible, Puig was arbitration eligible, and Wendell and Muncy were subject to the major league minimum. So what we have seen is the league becoming younger. This is using some baseball reference data, particularly batters. You can see the average age of hitters has gone down from about 29 in 2004 to almost 28 in the past year. Pitchers have become younger as well, just not quite as dramatically. But particularly important in terms of how players are paid, service time is declining as well. Now this graph is showing average weighted service time. So what I did is if a player got called up from the minors halfway through the season, his service time got half the weight as a veteran who's been in the league the entire year. So average weighted service time, you can see over the last 11 years, has gone down from a little bit north of 3.9 years to a little bit south of 3.7 years. From this point in the presentation forward, the data I'm going to be using is from COTS Contracts, which is a subsite that we have at Baseball Reference, and it contains service time data for all players on 40-man rosters from 2006 to the present. The reason why I'm starting in 2008 is I needed a little bit of a gap to account for players who were missing time in the year prior to 2008. So that's where the data for these 11 years are for service time. This is an interesting graph, but ultimately I didn't want to use average service time for this analysis because there's a problem with using averages, and I can illustrate that by last year's Rangers. Average service time on the Rangers was about a year more than the MLB average, which would make you think that that's an older team. However, the Rangers also rostered for the full season the 2 most tenured players in MLB last year. They had Adrian Beltre and Bartolo Colon. If you just remove those 2, the Rangers become a league average team in terms of service time. And if you further remove a lot of pitchers who are no longer with the club, they actually become a younger than average team. So instead of using average service time, what I decided to do, and I'm going to show you a bunch of slides with this, is look at service time by experience cohort. First-year players, second-year players, third-year players, et cetera. So I started with rookies, players with less than a year of experience, and what you'll see is that last year, rookies accounted for 28.3% of all service days in the majors. That's near an all-time high for rookies. I do not know what was going on, particularly in 2013, 2014, but you can see in general there's a slight increase over time there. If we look at second and third year players, the other arbitration eligible players, you can see that they've moved in slightly different directions. The trend for third year players is a little bit down. The trend for for second year players is a little bit up. So what we're seeing is overall pre-arbitration players are up, but within that window, within those 3 years, we're seeing more on the first year of experience side, fewer in the third year. What's interesting here is that, and this has been true since I started collecting these data, the number of players in the majors who are not eligible for arbitration in terms of days on major league rosters constitutes the majority. This is most players in the majors, and you can see just over the last 4 years, it's up by about 3%. If we look at players who are eligible for arbitration, those are ones in their 4th, 5th, and 6th years. Same thing is occurring as we saw with the pre-arbs. We've got more players with less tenure, the 4th year players, fewer players with more tenure, That's the 6-year players. So while overall arbitration-eligible players have remained sort of steady between 23-24% of service time days over the last few years, got the same thing where it's being skewed a little bit more towards the younger side, a little bit less towards the older side of experience. So the early morning math problem for you is if we're seeing an increase in pre-arb players, we're seeing about a flattening of arbitration-eligible players. Where do you think the league's going with free agent-eligible players? It's down. Over the last 11 years, last year at about 23%, had the lowest percentage of players on major league rosters who are eligible for free agency. So pre-arb up, arb-eligible flat, free agency eligible down. I also looked at this, and I'll explain why in a few slides, pitchers versus hitters, because they're a little bit different here. Two issues of dichotomy. First, if we look at pre-arbitration hitters and pitchers, those who are in the league 0, 1, or 2 years, two things going on here. One, a lot more pitchers are pre-arb than are hitters. Hitters have been, fluctuating a little bit below 50%. Pitchers are up. They're trending towards 58% of all days on rosters. For pitchers are guys who are not eligible for arbitration. If we look at arbitration eligible, it's more even between the two, maybe a little bit of fluctuation there, but about the same number of hitters and pitchers are on major league rosters are eligible for arbitration. They're in their 4th through 6th years. And then free agency eligible, both of them are trending down in the last few years. And on top of that, sort of the flip of what we saw for the pre-arb players, there are more hitters who are free agency eligible than pitchers. It's approaching only 20%, 1 in 5 pitchers are actually eligible for free agency. The reason why I wanted to point this out, the difference between hitters and pitchers, and that pitchers have less tenure on average than do hitters, is what's going on major league rosters. Pitchers constitute the majority of players in Major League Baseball today. We crossed the Rubicon there in 2012. That was the first year in which consistently over 50% of roster days were occupied by pitchers rather than hitters, and it's just gone up since then. And absent any kind of change in the rules, and I'm going to get to this, in how rosters are constituted, I think that red graph there is going to continue to go up and to the right. Now, the reason why I'm discussing all of this is, as everyone is probably aware, the current collective bargaining agreement between Major League Baseball and the Major League Baseball Players Association expires in December of 2021, which means for at least almost the next 3 years, let's hope not beyond that, this is what we're going to be hearing a lot of, is what's going on in those negotiations. We're a long ways away from those actual negotiations to occur, but certainly just in the last few weeks, we've heard some kind of ominous-sounding storm clouds from both sides. So let's look at where we might see some conflict. First of all, the pre-arbitration players, as exemplified again by Blake Snell getting renewed for just $573,000, they're constrained by the major league minimum, which is not only a floor, but not very much above that is effectively kind of a ceiling as well. And what I've done is I've charted the progression of the MLB minimum since 2012. 2012 to 2019, it's grown at a compound annual growth rate of about 2.1%. Under the current CBA, it will go up the next 2 years by a CPI-based inflator that, given current inflation numbers, would be a 2.7% increase. So the minimum salary, that again is what is the floor for over half of all players in the majors, has been going up in the 2% range. And according to Forbes, over the last 25 years, MLB revenues have increased by an average of about 13% a year. So there's a dichotomy there that I think is getting recognized. Second is, I showed you that pitchers have less experience than hitters do. They're less experienced and therefore less able to negotiate higher salaries. But at each level of experience, pitchers also make less than do hitters. What I've done here is I've graphed average salaries of hitters minus the average salary for pitchers. This is from 2015 to 2017. I did not cherry pick the data. It's because those are the only years for which COTS Contracts has salary data as well as service time data available for everybody on opening day rosters. And so I took hitters minus pitchers, which means that a positive differential, which is all that you see here, means that hitters make more. Red is mean, blue is median, and what you can see is that at every level of experience, from 1 year, I went all the way up to 10, hitters make more than pitchers. So pitchers have less experience. At every level of experience, they make less. One of the proposals that was floated over the last few weeks by MLB would be to expand rosters to 26, but to cap the number of pitchers at 12. There are reasons that have nothing to do with compensation that I think this is not the topic here, but I think there's reasons to support any cap on the number of pitchers. But from the union's point of view, unions are generally not in the business of negotiating away the jobs of their members, and a proposal like that would obviously put the 13th pitcher on MLB rosters out of work. But we should also keep in mind that that 13th pitcher is blocking the third catcher, the fifth outfielder, the four corners, bat off the bench, who's right now in AAA, who, were he in the majors, would probably have more experience and be making more money than pitchers do. The other ramification of what has been going on, I think, can be illustrated by some graphs I'm going to show you that shows how much players make. Again, this is using 2015 to 2017 data based on their years in the majors. There have been some proposals that I've read to move free agency eligibility up by a year. Currently, you have to be in the majors 6 years. Maybe if we move it up 5 years, the bump in salaries that players get from being able to auction off their services would accrue to them faster. And so what I've done here is I've got graphs, again, red bars are the means, blue lines are the medians. This is 2015 opening day rosters. This is for hitters. And what you can see is that as players gain more experience in the league, they make more money. Big jump there in year 7. That's the year that players become eligible for free agency and they make more money. So I cross-hatched year 7 on the graph. Year 4, I did the same just because that's the year that players become eligible for arbitration. So that's 2015 opening day hitters. Here's the graph for pitchers. You can see the same, a little bit flatter progression. This is 2016 hitters. The next few graphs, the far right side there, years 8, 9, and 10, they're a little bit noisy. Keep in mind, those aren't particularly large sample size, so I wouldn't read a lot into that. But again, you're going to see the same pattern. Year 7, there's a big increase because players are eligible for free agency for the first time. Year 4, there's an increase as well. This is pitchers, kind of a big increase for median for arbitration eligible here. And then in 2017 for hitters, it's a little bit flatter, and here's the numbers for pitchers. In putting this together, I had one of these moments that I really enjoy when doing this kind of research, because when you go into research projects, usually, you have some sort of, not necessarily a conclusion you want to prove, but something that you expect you're going to find. And I was expecting to be able to show you the big increase in salary that would accrue to players if we moved the eligibility for free agency up a year from 6 years of experience to 5 years. And so to do that, what I did is I made a graph, or a table, that shows years 1 through 7, how much players make on average and how much of an increase they get. And there absolutely is a big increase in salary that players get in the 7th year when they become eligible for free agency. About $2 million more for hitters, and these are medians, which are really the salaries that most players could expect to get. About $1 million more a year for pitchers. But what I wasn't expecting to find is that those increases, those dollar increases, are virtually identical when a player goes from his 3rd to his 4th year, when he becomes arbitration eligible. And on top of that, from a percentage basis, what a player makes from going year 3 to 4 absolutely dwarfs what they get for becoming eligible for free agency. And also from a tactical negotiating standpoint for the Players Association, moving up arbitration eligibility would affect about 50% more players than would moving up free agency eligibility, just because there are fewer players who last long enough to be able to benefit from free agency. So given that data, what could be the battlegrounds, or I guess this probably should be what should be the battlegrounds, because we suggest something doesn't necessarily happen, it's going to be true. But where could we see contention over the next nearly 3 years? And what I'm going to ask you to keep in mind as I show you this, and I'm going to emphasize it, keep the number 50% in mind, because all these things, there's a 50% component to it. First of all, higher minimum salary. This would benefit over 50% of all players in the majors. As I showed you, 50% of players are not eligible for arbitration. Those players make scarcely more than the MLB minimum, which has been rising in the 2% range per year. This would be a benefit to, like I say, most players in the league. Second one, arbitration after 2 years. This has two merits in my mind. One is that, as I showed, it would, or at least historically, the last few years, it would provide as much of a dollar boost and a much bigger percentage boost to players than earlier eligibility for free agency, and also would affect far more players, about 50% more players, than would earlier free agency. This also has the merit of actually having been the case for arbitration the first 12 years it was in existence. It was negotiated out of the standard contract in the 1985 CBA, but there is a history of players becoming eligible for arbitration after 2 years, for whatever that's worth. There isn't one of players being eligible for free agency. And again, this would be a much bigger benefit to players, affecting 50% more than would earlier free agency. And finally, a proposal similar to what MLB floated. Anything that would involve larger rosters obviously would be beneficial to players in aggregate, because there would be more players earning a major league salary, but also any cap on the number of pitchers on rosters would result in more dollars in the average player's contract, simply because, number one, pitchers on average have lower tenure than hitters. Number two, at each tenure level, pitchers make less than hitters. And number three, there are just a lot more pitchers currently in the league than there are hitters. So that's where I think we could be seeing bones of contention, or should be seeing them. I've been reading a lot about the earlier free agency. I don't think that's as much buck for the bang. I didn't say that wrong. That was meant to be buck for the bang, as there would from earlier arbitration. So before I take questions, just a couple thanks. That's the URL for the COTS compensation site. It's a great site if you're doing any kind of work on rosters or salaries. Almost everything, Jeff Houston helped me out here, but almost everything he's got on the site is it's like open source. It's downloadable spreadsheets. Also want to thank SABR for this conference. Sixth year in a row I've been here. It's always a blast. And our friends at Sports Information Services were good enough to help with all the presentations that you've heard. So with that, I can take any questions. Yeah. Meredith.
I guess I'm wondering if we move the arbitration date, and therefore, I have no problem with younger guys getting paid more. I can see that being used, however, as a justification to keep the minor league player salaries as low as they are when they're really honestly, the revenue's going up, you're right. There should be more push for the minor leaguers to get paid at least a living wage so that they don't have to be living with, say, host families
Right.
that are volunteering to help the Major League Baseball team, et cetera, or living on sandwiches, or, I mean, you know, all the stuff. And so I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. By the way, I'm going to repeat the questions because this presentation will eventually be available on the web, and then my mom can hear what all the questions were. Mom, I hope that cough has gotten better. The question was about minor league salaries. Unfortunately, as you know, there's not really an advocate for minor leaguers in that the MLBPA, I mean, by its name, they support Major League. You know, I've been thinking about what the MLB, you know, I've listed a bunch of things that I think the union should go to the owners and say, here's where we want more money. And I haven't really come back with anything that they would give up necessarily. And I'm wondering whether there are PR wins that the MLBPA could get from doing things like supporting, even though some of its membership doesn't like it, some of the pace of play initiatives, or more more money for minor leaguers. The additional problem, obviously, that we would have in raising minor league salaries is that Congress was complicit enough to make a law that you don't have to pay minor leaguers minimum wage. But it certainly, I think, would be desirable if players who are going to be major leaguers were able to make enough money that they could, afford good nutrition and be able to work out in the off season. But until some team takes that initiative, I don't know where it's going to come from, but I absolutely agree that it's something that would be beneficial.
If you moved arbitration up a year, back to 2 years, would there be any likelihood, or is there any data that would suggest that there might be more non-tenders in that circumstance?
Yeah, the question is, would moving up arbitration result in more tenders? Non-tenders, yeah. I think inevitably there would be some more. And if you look at, let me see, where is that one? So this is you put all these, here we go. The number of players from 2 to 3 years experience when you're still ARB eligible, it drops by 17 hitters, and then it drops by 50% more when they become ARB eligible. I'm not going to look at pitchers as much because a lot of what goes on with pitcher numbers involves injuries. I think, yeah, there would be anything that's going to result in a systematic change that results in a certain type of player getting more money is going to inevitably create some unintended consequences. And I think one of those unintended consequences would likely be more non-tenders. On the other hand, there's still a lot of players who are third-year players who are really good. So what this data would suggest that even if you knock a few players, would then get non-tenders, the benefit to the overall number would still, it's one of these examples of, diffuse benefits, concentrated costs. I think the diffuse benefits would outweigh the concentrated costs. Yeah.
When the union started negotiating with CBA with Marvin Miller, he limited free agency. Marvin was an economist, and the issue of scarcity was very important. So we would have, to inflate the numbers, there was 6 years. But at the time, we didn't have analytics, and I think there was a premise that veterans brought value. That has now been diminished. And so why even have arbitration? Why not be going in and saying, look, after a year or two, you're a free agent? Because what would then happen, I believe, is the players who are bringing value, the younger ones in your career, you would get the value when you deserve it. And if you were able to have longevity, your subsequent contract would reflect that. And so, signing a 10-year contract at age 23 for $300 million may be a lot more reasonable than what we're seeing now. So I want to know what your thoughts are on just eliminating arbitration, going right to free agency.
Yeah, the question is whether it makes sense to get rid of arbitration, just go directly to free agency. Back when, I'm sure you know this, back when this first came up, Charlie Finley, after the Peter Seitz ruling, proposed just make everybody a free agent after every year, and Miller was pretty vehemently against that. And so were the other 23, I guess, owners at the time, partly because it was Charlie Finley who was saying that. The idea that a completely free market would price guys up, but also price guys down really rapidly. The concern there would be a proliferation of one-year contracts rather than multi-year contracts to lock players in. I would be somewhat concerned that that would in fact be the case. Look, there's been a lot of hand-wringing. Hand-wringing sounds like I'm making light of it. The analytics community has taken a bit of a hit, and I think it's somewhat justified that, in a way, we bear some responsibility for veteran players not getting paid as much as they used to. And, let's face it, because we've demonstrated that a lot of older players aren't really that good. Which has resulted in, the contract lengths have been kind of compressed, and you could see that declining number of free agent eligible players. I'm not sure that an earlier free agency would do anything, would not just continue that pace, that we would see player contracts compress. I mean, one of the things that makes our sport unique is that contracts are guaranteed, and so players can count on them. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
The NBA, they don't have arbitration, but they do have a limitation of 5 years guaranteed. But that's the NBA 5R, and without that, you were getting NBA teams signing players for 7, 8 years, young players. I would argue that we don't know because we haven't done it. But if you look at the NBA, if I'm a general manager and I see, Chris Bryant is a young player and I want to lock him up, or Mike Trout, instead of, and they've done that. Some teams have done
Right.
that to avoid
Right.
arbitration. That could happen. So I'm not sure that you would see what Finley said would happen. It's hard to prove because it's something that we've never had.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In full disclosure, I'm not a labor guy. I'm a kind of a economist type rather than labor person. I can't really speak to that. But you're right. There's nothing. The Angels did lock up Trout, as you could see in the slide, for a lot of money prior to his arbitration eligibility. The Cubs have chosen not to. Obviously, the Rays certainly aren't doing it with Blake Snell. So there's nothing in the current setup that prevents that behavior other than that there's not a lot of initiative. But yeah, that would be something that someone a little better versed in labor issues than I would probably be able to speak to.
With regard to limiting the number of pitchers on a roster, is any thought been given to a criteria for declaring when someone is a pitcher? Could teams work that to put more so-called pitchers on the roster? Meaning, like, if you have someone play first base for 1 out, is he now a position player?
Yeah, the question is, if you're going to cap the number of pitchers, how do you define what a pitcher is? Obviously, Ohtani brought this to a head, but also there's, several teams have employed position players as pitchers. Until we see a number of true two-way players, J.D. Davis pitching 6 pretty good innings doesn't really count. I don't think that that's going to be much of an issue. There aren't a lot of two-way players around, but certainly you could set some sort of limit. You base it on plate appearances versus batters faced or something like that. But there's not that many hybrid players. My opinion, bring them on. I think those are fun guys to have in the league anyway. Yeah, Richard.
Do you think the 26 slot would actually help increase salaries all that much? Because the way that I would think about it is that there's only so many at-bats and since there's so many innings finished in the season. And most likely those at-bats will come from other part-time players. Not 25 man roster, which is specialization and versatility. Somebody who plays first and third and left and right would be less valuable because now you get someone who plays first and third and someone who plays left and right field. So how do you think a 26 slot would actually help, the average major league or the average bench player major league?
Oh, the question, what kind of economic input would a 26 player have? It would increase payrolls by whatever the minimum salary is, no question. I mean, the 25th player on rosters now is a marginal player. It's going to be some middle reliever who, Gerald Schiffman at our site wrote a piece last week about the number of times players with options are getting shuttled back and forth from the minors. It would be a low salary player, but it would be another player making an MLB salary rather than a minor league salary, and who would then be in line to potentially move up the ranks and get the salaries commensurate with more tenure. But certainly, it would increase the membership. It wouldn't change the economics a lot. Yeah.
I forget from one of your earlier slides, the 103 OPS plus number for younger players.
Yeah.
What was the time frame on that?
That was just 2018.
Did
Yeah.
you happen to look at that trend?
I lifted Sam Miller's research, and no, he didn't. But I know that historically, young hitters have not performed as well as young pitchers. But I don't have the exact numbers.
What I'm thinking about is, has the performance of younger players improved recently compared to years ago?
Yeah, I think, okay, don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure that Rob Arthur did a study of this. Might have been when he was at 538, but the answer is yes, that young, and this is hitters, we're not talking about pitchers, because there's been a reluctance to move 22-year-olds into starting rotations like, back in the days of Dwight Gooden. But that young hitters are comprising a larger proportion of rosters, and they're doing better as well. But I don't have the data here. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for listening.